Globuspan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globespan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
Globespan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globespan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavor, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity.
Good evening, colleagues, and welcome to Globespan 24/7. I am your host, so to speak, this evening, Terrence Blackman, and I am joined by Timothy Jonas, prominent attorney and political commentator, political leader in Guyana. And tonight, well, first let me apologize for the fact that we're starting just a few minutes late, a few technical difficulties. And for that, we want to thank Devin Bassoon for the sterling work that he's doing behind the scenes to make this possible. Tonight, the task is to, in a sense, analyze Guyana's corruption perception index. And I suppose we should do a few things, just kind of understand, what the corruption perception index is. It's a tool for measuring perceived levels of public sector corruption globally. I'll maybe say a few words about the scoring system of the corruption perception index and give a sense of Guyana's historical overview in that context. And, think about how Guyana compares with neighboring countries in terms of what sort of regional patterns exist. Think of countries with high corruption perception index scores, countries with low scores. And then perhaps, have Timothy sort of share his perspective on the current state of corruption in Guyana, and perhaps discuss some concerns about transparency and major developments, and then hopefully we can get to the place where we talk about some strategies for improving Guyana's corruption perception index. So I want to welcome you this evening, Timothy. Welcome you, the audience, to this discussion on the perception index, and perhaps. To start with that, before I throw things to you, so the 2024 perception index score obtained by Guyana was 39 points. For some perspective, the worst possible score in the corruption perception index that you can have is 0, and a score of 100 sort of indicates that broadly there's no corruption is perceived in the respective country. The index is a composite indicator that sort of includes data on the perception of corruption in areas such as bribery of public officials, kickbacks in public procurement, embezzlement of state funds, and the effectiveness of the government's anti-corruption index. I wanted to start off by noting that, in a sense, question for Timothy. When one looks at the scores, you see in 2015 we're at 29, 2016 we're at 34, 2017, we're at 38, so we're increasing nicely. There's a dip between 2017 and 18. We go from 38 to 37. And then between 2018 and 2019, we go up to about 40. 1920, we go to 41, and then we're 39 and 40, 40 and 39. So in a sense, the corruption perception index, in a way, it's sort of stagnated. I mean, I don't think there's a big difference between 39 and 40. So we've been 39, 40, 40, 39. And so I want you to, in your introductory sort of remarks, what does this tell us about the corruption trends in Guyana? What does this sort of stagnation tell us about what's happening in the context?
Yeah. Well, I like that introduction. Thanks, Terrence. And I like that you immediately pointed out that the changes are marginal only, but that the overall result is completely unsatisfactory. I mean, if you're in your 30s going into 40 on a scale that 100 is perfect, then you're not where you should be by a long shot. And the fact is that, comparatively speaking, we do not rank well. Now, the government of the day will always criticize the index and its authors. And, they will always deflect by shooting the messenger rather than by an honest discussion about corruption. So I think, first of all, it's important to highlight that the method used by transparency in arriving at its yardsticks and arriving at its conclusions, I think that they need to be treated as reliable for a number of reasons. First of all, they carefully call it a perception index. And the reason they do that is that it's impossible for anybody or any organization to definitively measure the amount of corruption that's actually taking place. So what we're looking at in terms of perception is we're gauging the point of view of the average citizen. And when I say average citizen, I mean the stakeholder, whether it's in business, in academia, or in politics, or in the professions. The confidence that they repose in the systems implemented by government, in the systems we have. So what transparency does is they interview stakeholders to get their views on specific questions. Now, that, of course, can be criticized as not scientific. It's people's opinions. But I think that there are a couple of things that need to be remembered. If they use the same approach, ask the same questions, adopt the same target in terms of the people they're interviewing in all the countries under review, then whatever vagaries there are in the system, those vagaries exist in every location that they're conducting their survey. So that if their measurements are based on a comparative, as they are, some countries higher than 3940, some lower than 3940, it is because the same test was used. And I think some reliability can be discerned from that. The second thing is that corruption, citizens in countries are not fools. So when they give their experiences and they discuss the confidence or lack of confidence they have in the institutions, no one is going to be able to say definitively this minister stole or that bureaucrat bypassed the system, because people don't come out and loudly broadcast and advertise their wrongdoing. They hide it. And this is why it's about the perception. It's about the perception of the public and their confidence. But again, because people are not fools, usually that perception, when it is summed up, is often quite accurate. And if the same measurements, the same questions are being asked in each country, then the end result is something that is reliable and has to be looked at carefully. It can't just be discounted.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Guyana's score ranks it 87th out of the 180 countries. It positions Guyana below the global average score, which I think is around about 43. And so for sure, this sort of indicates a higher perception of public sector corruption compared with many, many other nations. I was wondering what are some of the key concerns that you see? Like, I mean, the anti-corruption reforms, the risks of corruption, rapid wealth accumulation. I've seen a number of stories along those lines in recently occurring in the newspapers with individuals with various properties in various places that cost significant amount of money. We've seen, questions around reform in the procurement process. What's your sense of why we've stagnated? You would think that, if we're doing good, then we're increasing year after year, and it seems like for a number of years we've sort of just flatlined. What's your sense of what are some of the contributing factors to us in a way stagnating in that manner?
Right. Well, the observation you made, interestingly, when you were talking about the little nuances, the little dips, the ebbs and flows in the perception index over the years, it showed a slight improvement after the PNC came into power in 2015. Now, so 2016, 2017, you saw improvements, and then you saw a dip before an improvement later on. Now, you that to any great policy or any good works by the PNC, what happens is that if you have an entrenched system and people bureaucrats and officers and officials and ministers and everyone who are entrenched in their positions, the system of corruption can grow and it can become systemic. And corruption feeds itself, which is something I hope we can talk about in this evening. So when there's a change in government, especially in Guyana, where a change in government doesn't just mean that the 15 or so ministers are replaced, but it means that almost every head of every agency, every senior professional in all of the state-owned enterprises, all of the cushy jobs, they are all replaced as well. So any individual corruption is rooted out as a natural consequence, not deliberately, not because of any good policy, but because the corrupt individual that was there is now replaced by someone who has to learn the system.
Let's see.
What you then saw is you saw a gradual increase in the corruption levels as the new person learned the ropes.
I see.
So I'm unfortunately, I'm regretfully coming to the conclusion that our problems are deeper than just politics. Our politicians are just a symptom, just another aspect, another part of corruption that is really endemic in our society. And I believe that, well, anybody who drives in Guyana knows about corruption. Anybody who deals with any of the state agencies, the NIS or any of them, knows about corruption. So I think we have to ask ourselves, well, why is the nation, why are the citizens so easily and readily willing to participate in corrupt practices so as to maintain us at that level? And I think that's the question that needs to be asked. And I want to hasten to say, I don't say that in a condemnatory manner. Citizens are entitled to live a life with dignity and self-respect in systems that work. And if you are confronted with a system that's unfair or a system that doesn't work, I'm not sure that you can be condemned as a matter of ethics if you try to improve your situation in that system that is unfair. 200 years ago, the law was that you and I were slaves. And I do not believe that anybody would have condemned us for breaking the law and corruptly fighting against that and getting out of slavery.
Oh, yes, that's true.
So I think we have to look at it as not an ethical situation, because everybody wants a better life. And if a better life and an easier life means paying somebody to shortcut so you don't have to stand in a line, well, is that really a personal, ethical, moral dilemma, or is that really a condemnation of the system and the people who are implementing that system? And I think that's what we have to genuflect on. That's what we have to consider when we are, with some introspection, when we are discussing the subject in Guyana. Where did it start, and how do we fix it?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying there, but take, for example, some of the things that we've seen in the infrastructure spends where roads are being built that don't have the requisite quality, in the procurement areas where one might perceive that this has been influenced in some way beyond what the merit criteria ought to have been. I think there is a place for saying, what are Guyana's anti-corruption institutions, and how effective have those anti-corruption institutions been in addressing issues of transparency and accountability? I mean, there's SARA, there's SOKU, there are all of these institutions that are there to nominally address. I mean, I see what, I would say, listening to you, there are two kinds of corruption. One kind of corruption, like me driving a car, being stopped by the police, I've seen quite a few videos where, people are being stopped because they have tints on their car. And then, this becomes a source of a kind of small time police corruption where, a small bribe is exchanged to look past the tint on the car. I mean, that's one kind of corruption. But then I think there are other kinds of corruptions which do more damage to the society. So large-scale corruptions and big construction projects, buying things and then not delivering them for the broad commonwealth. What's your sense of like our anti-corruption mechanisms, institutions, and how well are they working?
Well, I'm sorry, I actually don't agree with you on that. If a citizen in his day-to-day going to and fro in his day-to-day life doesn't have the dignity and the assurance that things will work, that systems will work, I think that is equally important. And I don't think that should be treated as less important than the politician who is stealing $20 million, awarding a contract that he shouldn't award. Because one feeds into the other. You see, here's the thing with corruption, and I want to use it at the ordinary level so that the day-to-day person who is involved, it's meaningful to that person. I don't want to speak about it as an abstract. You use the example of the traffic cop. So you got a policeman who's earning $100,000 a month, 500 US a month. And you put him on the road as a traffic cop. And by the end of the month, he's earning $500,000. Now, with the $100,000, he was probably having a hard time paying his rent, keeping his children in school. If his wife had an income, they were really rubbing pennies together, trying to make ends meet. By the time he reaches the 500,000, he's paid down on a car, he has a mistress, he got children with the mistress. His lifestyle, he can buy drinks for his friends, he can spend more money in restaurants. So his lifestyle has improved exponentially along with his income. He cannot go back to $100,000 a month. He can't. So the corruption feeds itself. And even if he's promoted, he has to be promoted into another system that allows him that level of income to maintain the lifestyle that corruption has allowed him to enjoy. This is why I say corruption feeds itself. Once you start, you can't stop. The same thing applies at the level of the government. That if you are awarding contracts to family and friends, and the arrangement is, we got a $100 million contract, you, Terrence, and my friends are saying to you, look, you bid 100, but of that 100, you got to give me 20. Well, immediately you are building an $80 million road instead of a $100 million road. And with that 20 I have in my pocket, when you come to me next month to do another contract, I can't tell you no because we have an arrangement. It has started to feed itself. But the quality of road you get that I have to drive on, where I should be driving on a $100 million road, I'm now driving on a $50 million road because you didn't just pay me 20, you made sure you paid yourself 30. And that's where it goes in. That's where it continues. So it is there. But the question, as you were saying, is how do we eradicate it? And are those institutions, like SOKU, you call SOKU and SARA, are those institutions the type of institutions, and are they structured in a way to solve corruption? Certainly they don't solve corruption at the level of the road, the man on the road. Do they solve corruption at a higher level? I'm not sure.
No, so you mentioned, as you were talking about the police officer on the street, I was reflecting the recent news reports with the senior police officer who had, an inordinate amount of money as part of his, and so it seems to me that is something that goes right through from the person sitting at the bottom to the person all the way at the top. And I mean, so then you tell me, because I had a thought of, well, how do I get something like SOKU? How do I get something like SARA? How do I, what's the mechanism? So if one is to criticize the sitting government, say, look, this is unacceptable. Our corruption perception index has stagnated. It is clear that this stagnation suggests that corruption is a persistent challenge. Even though this 1% drop is not significant, it certainly suggests that the perception of corruption has worsened slightly rather than improving. Okay, give me advice about how I begin to address this issue within the context of the Guyana that you've described.
Okay, that is going to take the entire hour. But
I have time. I'm not late.
I would like to suggest that it has to be dealt with by leaders in each area of endeavor. First of all, frontally confronting the issue and identifying its source, and then figuring out how to resolve it, having identified its source. Now, I'll give you the example. I like that you brought up the traffic cops. We know that is a source of revenue for policemen. I mean, that's been the case since the 70s. That hasn't changed as part of our culture. And I have seen efforts by the police hierarchy to make inroads, commendable efforts. But the inroads that they are trying to make, they're doing it by a side glance. They're not publicly acknowledging that this is the problem and we are fixing the problem. What they're doing is they're implementing measures that they hope will have the result of improving things. But I'm not sure that that's enough. I'll give you some examples. The first rule that was brought in, first of all, you're driving on the road and you don't want to be inconvenienced. So if you're stopped by the police and you're faced with the threat of arrest, that invitation to go to the station, that draconian impact on your convenience, on your liberty, on what you're going to do for the day, that power that the police arrogates to himself by saying, hey, I found something wrong, go to the station, that is the most fundamental infringement of your right. And you will do almost anything to extricate yourself from that position. So when you hear you're on the verge of being arrested or even inconvenienced by a trip to the station where you might sit down for 2 hours not knowing your future, you'll do almost anything to get out of that. And therefore, money is leveraged out of your pocket. The police hierarchy implemented a system of saying police may only stop you by a police station. They should not do it anywhere on the road. That is something that happened occasionally in Guyana. Of course, it was ignored immediately. So you had 2 weeks hiatus when you saw police the roads by police stations. And then after the 2 weeks, they were back on, every turn, everywhere. So it was ignored. Now, I believe that that was an attempt to get away from the abuse that was recognized to be happening. But because it wasn't done frontally and the public weren't told, look, these are your rights, these are your powers, and this is what you can do, it didn't work. The second attempt that I'm seeing now is that we are being told that police must have body cameras that are on at all times. Now, that will have the effect of recording the interaction. I promise you it's not going to last more than for 3 months. Because you simply cannot be recording the interaction where a bribe is taking place. So what might happen is you might get an invitation to the station, and then at the station somewhere else, the bribe is paid. So it doesn't work. And the interesting thing for me is that the solution is obvious, but the solution is not something a lazy person will adopt. You should not be arrested unless the policeman arresting you, does not know who you are and does not know where to find you. Because you're not a threat to the society, you're not breaching the peace. So if the rule was strict, you stop someone because you've seen something wrong with their vehicle, you have reasonable cause to stop them. You shouldn't just stop them routinely. You can only stop someone where you have reasonable cause. And you find something wrong, you write them a ticket, and they go their way. Now that is something that will allow people to maintain their dignity, to continue going about their business, and to pay their ticket or to fight it another day. The problem with that is that we're lazy. And our police don't want to do that. But that is what should be insisted on, because when you're stopped, you show your license, or if you don't have a license, you show your ID. You show something. So the policeman knows who you are, he knows where you live, he knows how to find you. He can send a summons for you to go to court because he knows where to find you. There is no need for an arrest. And if that's the approach that's taken, that is one element of corruption that will quickly disappear in Guyana, and then we can go on to the next problem.
As you mentioned it, I mean, just to offer a larger lens. I mean to it. So as you think about the police, and the police have a political hierarchy to which they have to respond, and to what extent do you believe that political hierarchy impacts the enforcement of the anti-corruption laws in Guyana?
All right.
Police are not acting blind by themselves. There's the police commissioner works independently, but independently within the context of a political system where there are people who he or she has to answer to.
No, I think that what you're hitting on there goes to the root of the societal problem, which is education and competence. You can't have an efficient, well-oiled, well-working machinery of any institution unless the people in that institution are competent. If you check the qualifications to join the police force, back in the colonial days, it used to be to join, if you're joining as a rank, a sound primary education. But back in the 50s and 60s, a sound primary education was a smart man. It was a man who was well-read, well-reasoned, knew basic maths and algebra, and could manage himself in an office. We have, at the bottom, we have ranks who are barely literate. And that's sad, but it's true. So if you are taking in people of a quality that cannot write a ticket, cannot articulate what they found and how it is that they arrived at reasonable cause to believe that you had done something wrong, then you're starting out as a failure. You cannot succeed. You can't build your house on that. That's some very sandy soil. So we go back to that. And why do we attract that quality at the bottom? The reason is because when they're going out, they get in $100,000 a month. So we're not going to focus on police, I hope, but since the discussion now is on police, we got to pay them more so that we attract a better quality of person into the force. When we attract a better quality of person, you will see an improvement in ethics. You will see them have dignity, because if you're paying them reasonably, they can pay down on their car, they can pay down on their house. Their quality of work will be better, and they will develop a pride in their uniform that I think the hierarchy in the police is finding it difficult to instill, because it is known that down at the bottom there, that level, the corruption is rampant.
So you said, let's go away from the police. How would you assess the judiciary, of which you're a part, in terms of its relation to handling corruption?
Well, that's like asking me if I blame a doctor because the hospital doesn't have drugs. You see, we're cogs in a wheel. My experience of our judiciary, especially recently, is that they are doing a good job. But it's not for a judge to walk out onto the road to solve problems of corruption. And a judge hears a case that's brought before him. So to introduce the judiciary in a discussion of corruption, I don't think it moves us forward. Look, Terrence, what causes corruption? It's the first thing that causes corruption is inconvenience. If you have to join a line, you will pay money to be put in the front of that line. That's the truth. That's the bottom line. So I'll give you an example.
I have to join lines every day. I mean, many people come from Guyana to New York, join lines every day, and will not, reach out and pay someone. It's completely unacceptable. So it's not, there is no. You understand that there is a consequence to that activity. I've been stopped by the police on the street. I dare not sort of say, why don't you let me go? I'll leave something with you here. So, I want to say that
let me challenge you on
so
those.
fatalistic about it, as if, well, it can't change. So then, why worry about the corruption perception index then?
Let me challenge you on those two. You've drawn a comparative, you in the States and me here. So I'll take the two examples that you have. You see, what you have in the States is people who, first of all, believe that the system works, so that they are in the system and they go through it. But the systems do work. I'll give you an example of a line that we join here in Guyana, and you can see if you have an equal comparison. The passport office has an informal quota, the number of passports they will process every day. I can't remember the number. It might be 50, it might be 80, it might be 100. But when they reach that number, they do not process any more passports that day. So being informally and aware of this, you know that you got to get to that passport office early enough in the morning that you are between number 1 and 50 in the line. So you will have people 5 o'clock in the morning at the passport office. And I'll challenge you to tell me when last you've had to wake up to be somewhere 5 o'clock in the morning to get into a line. Now, if you are not inclined to be there 5 o'clock in the morning, because of that inconvenience, and let me tell you, you're not helped tomorrow, because if you're not the first 50 this Monday, tomorrow you got to reach there to be the first 50. You don't progress up in a system that works. You're starting over from scratch tomorrow. If you're not inclined to do that, then you got to persuade somebody who has the power to put you to the front of that line, to put you within the first 50, or else you're in trouble. So if the system doesn't work, there will be corruption, and it is not an indictment on the people who pay to be at the front of the line. Terrence, I don't want to be waking up 5 o'clock in the morning to go for a passport. So how do you fix the system? And we talked about the person on the scene, on the site, in that particular area of endeavor fixing it. A suggestion for them would be a numbering system where you go online and you book a time. So you don't make everybody go at 5 o'clock. You get your booking online at 8. I get my booking at 10 past 8 or quarter past 8. If I'm 5 minutes late, I miss it and I got to do it again tomorrow. So you stagger it that way. You give them a numbering system so that online you get your numbering system before you even get to the passport office. I can book today and I know, well, the 50 for today is sorted, but I got a space tomorrow or the next day. Every single international airline does it. You go online and you see what seats are available and you book the seat. The second thing that they can do is they can allow you to process your paperwork online before you get there so that it's less painful. Now, with those two simple expedients, you don't pay to get to the front of the line anymore, and you have removed an opportunity for corruption. I can give you an example where that's actually worked. The ferry going across Essequibo. You can book the ferry online. It works so smoothly. You know where you can't book it online? The ferry going to Suriname. So when you go to Suriname, and I've been by boat, you drive down there and you cross on the ferry. You have to get there at 2 o'clock in the morning because it's only 2 ferries a day. And when you get there at 2 o'clock in the morning, there's already a line because people have gone the day before, parked their car in the line and gone back to a hotel to sleep, to get back. There are people who live there, who park their cars there. And when you turn up for a sum of money, they will move their cars and allow you to park in their spot so you're ahead in the line. Now, there you have a system that is so rotten that anybody will pay to avoid it. So you have corruption being bred because of a bad system. And all they need to do is allow people to book the ferry in advance online, pay their money, they make it or they don't make it. The second thing that needs to happen is that the rules, bad as they are, need to apply to the people who are making the rules. You see, if I can make the rule and say, you got to line up, but then I turn up and I get a VIP pass and I drive straight past you because I'm the rule maker, I'm not too concerned about your plight. And yet that's what we see in Guyana all the time. So the same Suriname ferry, you will see a government minister or a bureaucrat turn up with a VIP pass, drive past that line that you've been in since 2 o'clock in the morning and get onto the ferry, and you have to wait for the next ferry. The ferry can hold 19 cars. Nobody tells you how many cars are there waiting. It's your luck. Same thing with the passport office, is luck. Are you number 20 or are you number 18? So you will pay to get through in that line. And the obligation, the onus needs to be on the people who are in charge there to set up that online system to say, if you're traveling next week Tuesday, book it now, pay now, get there for 7 o'clock when the barge is leaving, and you will be on it because you've already paid and booked. If we don't have people who are competent and who are willing to implement systems and create systems who are innovative so that we can go through the systems with our dignity intact without waiting in a line unduly, of course there will be a line, but without waiting unduly in a line, you won't pay the bribe. Corruption will be removed. So going back to you, I know you've been in lines, but have you been in lines since 5 o'clock in the morning, find out you're not 1 to 50 and got to come back tomorrow 5 o'clock in the morning?
Not recently. I'll say that. No, but I hear what. But there are two points that emerge right there. So, we've looked at this. So what you seem to be saying is, look, this business of corruption has a kind of endemic quality to it. It's a way in which people try to make their lives easier within the broad system. So then it's just two things. If I am someone who is in charge of the system, I have two options. I can impoverish myself, so to speak, by making the system easier, or I can continue to ratchet up the system by making it a little more complicated and a little more arcane, because the more complicated and the more less dignified it becomes, then that has a financial, a pecuniary benefit to me. So I worry a little bit there that there's, what's the incentive for changing the passport office? Say, for example, I know it's the tickets are numbers 1 through 80, and I know that I can sell each of the slots 1 through 80. This supplements my income, why am I even thinking anything else? I might be thinking I should make it 1 through 50 every day and increase the value of every slot that gets sold every day in the line. So what's the incentive for the ordinary manager in an office to think creatively about that process?
Right. Now, that's an interesting analysis, and it is hitting the nail exactly on the head, because I can tell you that I can think immediately of two institutions. If you're clearing goods off a ship and you fill out your custom declaration form and you close your eyes and put it where it should go, that form does not move because you haven't done what you have to do. If you apply for building permission at the main city council and you close your eyes and you put your application in and don't look at it, it does not move because you haven't done what you're supposed to do. If you're applying for land at central housing, it does not move unless you do what you're supposed to do. So you already have at that mid-level management people who will happily take that application and put it into a drawer, make it disappear, freeze it until you do what you're supposed to do. The solution does not lie with the mid-level management, but I will say this: you have to pay people properly. That policeman who is earning $500 a month cannot be honest because he cannot feed his family. He is confronted every day by citizens with more money than him who look down on him because he does not have dignity in his job. If he was earning $350,000 to $400,000, he would have the dignity to stick his chest out and do his job properly. And you, as you said, could not dare to offer him a bribe because he's making as much money as you and he has dignity and pride in his uniform. So at the mid-level management, you make sure you pay them good. We have a history of paying poor salaries and we get what we deserve. But also at the top, so not mid-level management, at the top, those people who are in their plush offices at the top, earning lovely government salaries at the top, and do not come down from their ivory tower to fix problems. We got to find a way to make them accountable. And the way to do it, if they don't, of themselves, of their own professionalism, want to come to fix the system, and you're not removing them, is to make the rules apply to them. Now, I gave you the example about the people who usually get the VIP passes and jump the line. The best example I could think of that resonates more and more in Guyana, as we're becoming more affluent and quarreling about vehicles, is Parliament, where those 6 to 5 people sit down and every year continue the law that makes me pay 200% duty on some kinds of vehicles, so I will never be able to afford them, and give themselves duty-free exemptions on those same vehicles, so they drive around self-importantly in them. If you make the rules and apply the rules to me and exempt yourself from the rules so you can jump the line, we have a problem. But if those rules apply to you, you will make fair rules. You will get it right. And that's another thing that needs to be done here. This thing of exempting people, giving them exemptions, that needs to stop. And it needs to be seen visibly that if you're a member of parliament or you're a minister, you, your wife, your close affiliates cannot get any exemptions from the rules which are imposed on the rest of us. You'll see how quickly that thing turns around and we have fair rules.
You know, so I want to go to the business of, you know, you mentioned the increased salaries, and so I want to switch gears some. So, you know, thinking, I was watching on the internet earlier today, and looking at the oil and gas conference, and you know, I was thinking about the corruption perception index within the context of the oil and gas. You know, so, you know, you have this huge oil and gas boom. You know, you've attracted, you know, significant foreign investment. You know, all of these people, I mean, there are a couple of people there. You know, I looked at the photos, many people from many parts of the world experiencing Guyana, maybe first, second, looking to do business in Guyana. You know, how do you see sort of like the risks of this corruption perception index kind of feeding itself into this aspect, because in a sense it is this business that will pay your policeman $350,000, and so I mean, does the corruption perception index have the potential to erode the sort of foreign investment that is necessary for some of the things that you seem to be suggesting, and if so, then how do you really have to think about how you mitigate it beyond the sort of like localized approaches, but some larger societal approach that is driven by some political logic, some larger national development logic?
Right. Well, I can't emphasize this enough, that ministers and senior officials in oil and gas, employees of the state in oil and gas, should not be involved in any oil and gas businesses. We are developing a culture of middlemen. So when I say middlemen, what happens is you, the minister, you make your company and you bid for whatever contract you're bidding for. And of course you win the bid. And then you subcontract that same contract to the man who does the real work at a lower price. So you've made your profit as a middleman doing nothing. You're guaranteed the contract and you're guaranteed the subcontract. And we are seeing that happening often. We're seeing properties being bought from the state and then flipped immediately at enormous profit. So how do we solve that? How do we stop that from happening? We're seeing contracts awarded to favorites, bypassing the system of bidding. Just the other day, there was an announcement in the state by the state that proudly saying, I think 300 road building contracts awarded in Linden. Now, I know you've been to Linden. How many miles of road in Linden? To divide that by 300 contracts. You're talking about very small contracts, relatively speaking. I mean, we've heard about billion-dollar contracts being awarded on road building elsewhere. So those boys up there getting $10 million, $12 million contracts. Bypassing the system, because the award is so small, you don't have to go through the formal bidding process. The legislation requires that formal bidding process for the larger items. But that looks good politically. You're helping these Lindeners, but you're not. You're giving them crumbs. And you're giving them crumbs as a political gimmick. And you're doing it in a way that you're spreading it 300. But because you're spreading it, you're allowed to be under the legislative radar, so you can sole source. What we need, and going to solutions, is that we need the agency that reviews the contracts to be peopled by opposition members and independents. So if that agency got 5 people, 2 of them should be opposition and 1 should be a third party. 2 should be main opposition, 1 a third party. What that would do is it would ensure immediately that when Jonas says to his friend Terrence, hey, bid for this thing, it's $1 million. I can't be sure you're going to get it, because the entity that's deciding who wins that bid, I only got 2 seats there. 3 people don't like me on that board. The 2 opposition and the third party don't like me. I can't persuade them to give you that bid. And the magic that will happen then is that, believe it or not, the best bidder will win. Because the opposition similarly can't say to their friend, go and bid, and I'll make sure you get it. The best bid will win. And if the bidder doesn't do his contract properly, he won't get the next following bid. But what we see here now is we see people bidding, not doing the work, and still getting future contracts. We see people bidding and their pre-qualifying criteria don't meet the requirements set out by the engineer. And before you know it, the government-appointed selectors have changed the pre-qualifying criteria so that now they qualify and they win. So if that can be done because all 5 of those people on that agency have been appointed by the minister and his folk, you can't win. You
No,
have to
not to
change
cut you,
it so
but
that the
isn't there
opposition does.
something that sort of says, well, if I am if for example, I am the minister of natural resources, that I perhaps cannot be involved in having a company that is bidding with the Ministry of Natural Resources, or even peripherally involved, that should be in some kind of blind trust. And maybe, is there nothing that allows for disclosure of assets? So even if it is allowable by law, that there is some public transparent thing that says, okay, I'm the Minister of Infrastructure. I shouldn't have a company building roads that then petitions my agency to build, and maybe even if the laws don't prescribe something like this, then is there some mechanism that says, that identifies me publicly in some way, that someone can say, you're the Minister of Education, you shouldn't have a company building schools, that kind of thing. What's the institutional safeguards against that kind of corruption?
Politically exposed people are required to make declarations of their assets. And of course, anybody who thinks about it for a second will agree that if you're the minister responsible for whatever area of endeavor, you shouldn't be bidding for contracts in that area of endeavor. I mean, we've known this forever. If we've had lotto in Guyana for 30 years, if you work at the lotto company, you may not buy tickets, you can't win, or your spouse or your children. I mean, this isn't new, this isn't fancy, this is common sense, and yet it happens. But the question there really is not so much what are the institutions, because both governments in turn will boast institutions. They have a Freedom of Information Act, they have this thing that you got to declare your assets, and they got these nice criteria set out for public procurement that you got to bid and qualifying bidder, and they advertise and publish the results of the bid online. I mean, the consolidated fund that and the bank account in New York where we put the oil money, that's touted as this wonder of transparency. It's the implementation. And in the implementation, if you don't have sufficient policing and sufficient penalty, then you're wasting time, you're toothless. So I can tell you that under the procurement systems, you see very little about penalties for breaching the procurement system. I would like to see that if a member of the government, the person awarding the contract, if they bypass the statutory system without just cause, that there are fines and imprisonment resulting. That doesn't exist. So it doesn't have teeth. And in any event, if you are in the enclave with your family and friends, who's going to investigate? So you talked about SOKU, and I will ask you to remember that the people who work in these institutions are ordinary folk like you and me who are ambitious and upwardly mobile. They want promotions. How do you get a promotion? You got to stay good with the people that employed you. You got to stay good with your immediate supervisor. So if your immediate supervisor is buying and contracting with the police force, or buying and contracting with the government, are you going to go and investigate? Unless there is an independent and autonomous body that is governing this, you're not. If you're an engineer working at the Ministry of Public Works, and you know that somebody from the enclave, a family and friend, won the contract and is producing a poor road, are you going to refuse to certify it so he doesn't get paid? And when you get the phone call from above to say certify that thing or else, are you going to have the dignity to stand up and be the fool to be thrown out when everybody else is doing it? So unless the system allows the opposition to be in the room, and not just in the room, with the third party as the swing, so that decisions cannot be made by the government, whichever government it is, both were equally bad. Unless the system allows scrutiny by the opposition, you will have family and friends, you will have enclaves, and unfortunately, because our culture of poor institutions, of long lines, of loss of dignity, our culture has made us prone to corruption. It's easy to look away and hope that next time will be our turn to be in the first 50.
But it might be much more expensive to be in the first 50 the next time. You know, you mentioned the peripherally, you mentioned the National Resource Fund, and you know, I've also noting recently, you know, questions arising as to, you know, whether or not, you know, the way in which the monies in the fund is being spent, whether or not there's an appropriate auditing of the use of the resources. And there's some argument there about things going into a consolidated fund, and you know, whether or not one should know exactly what is being spent on what.
Let me interrupt. I'm sorry. Natural Resources Fund. The consolidated fund is the constitutional fund. Natural Resources.
Yeah. So, but I think the argument was that, you know, the argument was, well, we should know how the monies from the Natural Resource Fund is being spent and on what. And the response was, well, we put the Natural Resource Fund money into the consolidated fund. So in a sense, you already know, and, you know, I don't need to itemize for you what's going on there. And so I wondered whether or not you had a thought there as to whether or not there really needs to be some kind of stronger regulatory oversight mechanisms. I mean, you know, for the first time I'm having this conversation, I'm getting a little pessimistic because I'm worrying that, you know, look, at the personal level, at the family level, at the community level, there is this sort of general acceptance of a kind of corruption that really is, you can't blame it. It's sort of, it's part of the culture. It's part of the way people make their lives a little better. And then at the upper level, you're saying, well, look, I mean, I'm the Minister of Natural Resources. I can have a company. I can then, you know, bid on whatever things that I want to bid on. You know, there are some kickbacks involved. And so the $100 million road is really a $50 million road. But then this money will be spent. And the advantage that you ought to have gained, it's sort of like in this moment, you're making a bet. You're building infrastructure because you think, okay, the infrastructure is the thing that will be here for the long term when all the island gets sucked out of the ground. And now if you build shoddy infrastructure, if you don't use the money wisely to build the kinds of institutions that and structures that need to be built, then 20 years from now, it's time to rebuild them, and you can't rebuild them because you don't have the same income coming in. So in a way, I'm getting worried that this corruption thing is much more serious than I initially envisaged. I think this corruption can take the whole future away from us if we don't have a real strong sense that there are some steps that we need to take to mitigate them. And in a way, I don't hear you. I'm worrying that for you, most of the people I have the confidence, you're not saying to me, the solutions that you're giving me are sort of like, well, the managers in the passport office got to be a bit more creative. The folks who are running that ferry at Suriname got to be a bit more creative. But that's not going to get the whole thing done. And I'm thinking, you know, what's the insight here from Timothy Jonas about how we mitigate this, how we strengthen transparency, public disclosure, you know, how we establish some stronger regulatory and oversight mechanisms, you know? How does this parliament that votes itself for duty-free cars when everyone else, you know, how does the civil society put some pressure on them so that they abide by the same kinds of rules, right? How does the so-called person, you know, investigate the actual corruption without worrying that his boss might also be running a company in this regard? What say you in terms of how we get out of this bind?
Right. So to start at the top, first of all, again, I don't like abstracts. I like to talk about specific examples, specific instances, so that it's real, you can hold it. If we talk about Guy Oil, let's go to Chronicle, Guyana Chronicle, our famous rock. Now, in 2015, the Guyana Chronicle, the entire board was fired and a new board was put in with the change of government. In 2020, the entire board was fired and a new board was put in with the change of government. Each board populated the staff with their people. So in 2015, they were all fired. In 2020, all those reporters that were not seen to be loyal were fired and they started over. So the result is that you have a newspaper that preaches the government line and has to. And it exists for that purpose. What's the solution? My solution can only work if government is in a minority in parliament. That's the only way it can work. So if you give me the swing vote in parliament, allow me the 33rd seat, just that one seat, I will immediately propose a law that I know the opposition will agree to. The law will say that where there is any corporation, any company, in respect of which government is shareholder, and government has a choice on the appointment of boards, the leader of the opposition will be entitled to appoint 2 on that board, the government will be entitled to appoint 2, and the largest third party in parliament will be allowed to appoint 1. So that board will have 2, 2, and 1, 5-man board. Now, in Chronicle, when the 5 of us are sitting in that room, we will have to agree on who our CEO is, who our editor-in-chief is. The government will not be able to dictate who it is. The opposition will not be able to dictate, but they will have to agree. And you will be guaranteed that editor-in-chief will be professional. He'll be the best man for the job. More than that, when he does something that the government doesn't like, publishes an article critical, he will have 3 people protecting him. When he does something that the government likes, he will still have 3 people protecting him. He will have the dignity in his job to do the right thing and to act professionally. And in that dignity, he will feel secure and he will be doing a better job. Guy Oil, GPL, Guywa, NISIL that holds so much government property, Central Housing and Planning, Georgetown Hospital, Public Hospital, every EPA, Energy Agency, which gives licenses to import oil and gas, every single agency you think about, this will work. So with the change of government, you will not have good people like Vincent Adams fired. Because if he's the best man for the job, even if there's a change in government, that 2-to-1 ratio will secure him in his office because he was the best man for the job. And he could tell the government go to hell and he could tell opposition go to hell because 3 people will be backing him. And he can do his job properly. Now, if we fix the agencies that way, then the next time we see a concrete post falling over, we can have an honest investigation about why and true accountability. Because 3 people on that board, when they find out that that pole was not placed properly because somebody shortcut the system or a contract was awarded unfairly, they will be able to act, even if the other 2 don't like it. When in central housing, you hear that land has been given out on Heroes Highway and around the place, you know, if 3 people on that board were from the opposition and the third parties, that land couldn't have been given out. And that board would know what land is being allocated, what the rules are, who bid for it. And if 2 of them didn't like it and there was some corruption going on, even if the third party was part of the corruption, so they persuaded 3 of them to do it, the 2 minority would scream bloody murder in public. So it would immediately be public. This land has been sold and we bypass it, and we fought tooth and nail, and these three corrupt people are giving it away. The last time that happened was in GCOM. And that is why the attempt to rig the elections didn't work. Because the three PPP GCOM members came out and they screamed every single day and said, this is what's happening, this is what's happening. It was immediately public for everybody to see. If we could have that kind of transparency and that kind of accountability in all our boardrooms, in all our agencies, first of all, we would have the best people for the jobs. But second of all, we would know that every Guyanese is represented. Because the truth is, Terence, we could call it One Guyana, we could call it whatever the PNC called it in 2015. If the PNC is in power, only 50% of Guyana is represented. If the PPP is in power, only 50% of Guyana is represented. So with that 1/33rd seat, controlling Parliament and making it truly independent of the government, you can make a large step into corruption at day one.
Well, at least that's a good political solution. So I hear you saying, you know, the structure of GCOM might be the structure that you want to replicate at the various boards across the society, so that it offers representation both to the government and the opposition in some configuration that allows for the one thing which I might say with that solution might be that it might just completely slow everything down and nothing gets done, because there could be broadly the coming to an agreement might be problematic. But I think that's at least something that moves us forward. You know, you mentioned something which I also wanted to ask you about when you said screaming this. Is there a whistleblower law? You know, like in the US, usually these corruption cases, you know, there's always a whistleblower who can, I mean, does Guyana have like a whistleblower statute? Is this something that exists? And, you know, I can see for the reasons that you've already described why there are not going to be too many whistleblowers, but is there a whistleblower statute?
Not that I know of. And one of the things you got to remember about such a small society is that nothing's a secret. So if you disclose information, you're not going to be protected. You can't be put in witness protection program and put in some village that nobody knows you. We're a very small society. So no, to answer your question, I'm not aware of whistleblower legislation, but culturally, it's not going to happen. And practically, I don't see that protection is possible. You know, it's a funny thing. We talked about the legacy we get from slavery. And a thing I realized, I'm sure you're familiar, been out to Guyana a long time, but sure you will remember some of our lingo. Couture. Couture is a peculiarly Guyanese word. And it describes a person who has ratted on you to the authorities, who has spoken the truth to the authorities so that your deception, your dishonesty is exposed and you are now punished. You're a couture. And think about culturally how that identifies us. That the disgrace of being a couture, a whistleblower, is seen that way in Guyana. And that word has existed since the 40s. We have a lot to do culturally to change where we are, but we can only do it improving our institutions.
You see, in this sense, I was reading, you know, Exxon has produced the 500, since the start, they've passed the 500 million barrels of oil threshold. And so it seems to me that, you know, there is an obligation sitting someplace that we use this opportunity to move beyond, to jump the gap. And this conversation has made me worried that, in a way, the accountability and the public trust and the effective governance and the oversight mechanisms and the citizen participation and all of the things that we need are not going to be there. And it's going to be a hard slog for us to get there. And so I know we're coming up on the on the end of this. And so I need you. I know that you're normally the guy who's more pessimistic than I am, but strangely this evening I'm feeling a little pessimistic. I need you to kind of, you know, help me to be more optimistic about what you've been saying here tonight.
Okay. When I lost confidence in AFC after they had been subsumed into the APNU group and they had failed to draw any ethical line in the sand, and they were completely wiped out in terms of having an independent existence. This was by 2016, let's say. After I'd lost confidence and I got a small group together to try to create a political party to replace AFC, I had at that stage realized one thing, that you need a third party, not one that will join, but one that will be a third party. Because if you only have two parties, and when by two parties I mean if a third party joins one of the big ones, you would then back to square one with two parties. Then government controls parliament. Government will have that third seat. And that is untenable. It has failed in Guyana, especially since our tribal system recognizes an Afro government and an Indo government, and therefore it's easily identified. So people will vote along ethnic lines, and understandably so. And the only hope we have that I saw was a third party that made parliament independent if the opposition controlled it, as AFC managed to do in 2011, but then didn't do anything with that. So to give you some optimism, I want to point you to numbers that in 2015, after decades of PPP rule, when people were disillusioned and felt the corruption was terrible and had forgotten the wrongs done by PNC so many years ago. So at PPP's lowest ebb, PPP lost the 2011 elections by about 6,000 votes, by one seat. Now, 5 years passed, and in 2020, when the APNU group had demonstrated woeful incompetence, hidden $18 million signing bonus, victimized the former government members, had people like Roger Luncheon, old and frail, going down to Soak, who had Vincent Brassington in shackles, and Ashley Singh, both decent, harmless people who were not a threat to anybody. No need to shackle them, but shackle them. That kind of ugly, brutish behavior. So when they were at their lowest ebb, having not helped with a single economic policy that made sense, PPP won by one vote. One seat, 6,000, 7,000 votes. So what I want to say to you as a question of optimism is that the electorate that is entrenched, that is loyal to PPP and PNC, have, as a matter of demographics, essentially canceled themselves out. That small, tiny minority of 10,000, 12,000, 15,000, 20,000 voters, AFC in their best time, I think, had 35,000 votes. They genuinely have that swing vote. So if you want optimism, look for a third party that is tangible, that is solid, that is realistic, that is plausible, because there are 20,000 people in Guyana who are praying for that plausible third party to emerge. And if that plausible third party emerges, there will be a majority opposition controlled parliament. And then there will be the potential for the reform that AFC should have done back in 2011, but due to sloth, incompetence, or lack of vision, failed to do. But that is the optimism that I feel, that the two sides demographically have essentially canceled each other out numerically, and there is scope for that 15,000, 20,000 electorate to genuinely create an independent parliament.
Well, Timothy Jonas, I think you've made me sort of cautiously optimistic that Guyana can overcome this corruption challenge that we're facing. I think what you've kind of identified is that the key to focus on sort of structured reforms that really go to independent oversight. And I like this idea of GEOCOM, of the boards being structured along the lines of GCOM. I mean, the only issue I will raise there is that I think the question of how well it actually works in a practical sense could be, but certainly it addresses some of the questions that we've been dealing with. And I think this thought that you've just said there about, you know, the third party representation really, I think, makes a big difference. And I actually do think that that's in some substance way true. Structurally, I think you know, in spite of what folks might be reading or seeing, I think you rightly identified that from election to election, even good times, bad times, essentially, you know, you're one or two seats between these two historically major parties. And if there is a sufficiently strong middle where you can sort of identify one or two seats that can really force, in a way, some genuine cooperation between the two larger groups, that we might be getting there. And so maybe I have time to ask you one more. So as you look at the current kind of situation now, with, you know, the way in which things are kind of evolving for the PNC, the APNU, the way in which things are emerging for AFC, the way in which things are emerging for PPP. I mean, do you see? So perhaps what you're suggesting is that there should be no coalition, and that these groups should work independently. Do you see this possibility emerging in this context?
I have reservations about the AFC for the simple reason that the personnel in the AFC who aided and abetted an attempt to rig elections are there, and they are unrepentant, and they are oblivious to the fact that they have alienated people like me, and also the Guyanese who don't look like me, probably to a more severe extent. So I have a reservation about the AFC, and I say that with regret, because I have high regard for Mr. Hughes, who is now leading it, was not leading it at the time. I would like to see another party emerge to take on that challenge of being the plausible party. I hear what you say about the fear that maybe a board that has two sets of enemies looking at it might not cooperate. I don't think that's going to happen, because the business must get done. The projects must go on. But I would like to point out that the alternative is that you have a natural resource fund, and the minister turns up in Parliament to say, we're changing that act so I can take out more money than I was allowed to take out previously. We're doing an amendment. And if you all don't like it, too bad, because I got the third seat. And if you want to know where that money is going, too bad, because I got the third seat. Now, if the minister did not have the third seat, there would have to be a much more meaningful discussion about how that money is being allocated and how the money is being spent, and what returns we are getting on that expenditure in terms of quality of roads, quality of bridges, quality of drains, the holistic view of the infrastructure to see if we're just rebuilding what was there, or if we're genuinely applying it to help our other industries like mining and agriculture, which are there permanently while oil might be temporary. No one's having that discussion. And you can't have that discussion as long as the minister can go to Parliament and say, we're changing the law because we need to take more money out of the fund. And we're not telling you what we're doing with it. That third seat allows him to do that. And I think that is a worse situation than the situation you describe, where 5 people sit in the room who don't like each other and have to reach a conclusion.
Well, I think I do think that there's some merit there, and so I think we're on the 8:30 number. So I'll say, I think, thank you for a wonderful conversation. I think I can talk to you quite I can talk to you quite a bit, and I think ultimately what you're saying here is that this culture of corruption in Guyana will require a real sustained multi-pronged effort. But I think you've convinced me that it's possible if you have the right kind of institutional safeguards and incentives in place. And I think also the recent, the oil wealth provides us with an opportunity to invest in these reforms and secure a more transparent and accountable future. And I think with the right political configuration, right will, the right sort of civic engagement, I do think that we can, overcome this problem of corruption. But I fear that it is much more insidious than we imagine. And I think in some very kind of silent way, I think this is much more detrimental to us as a society. And so, one hopes that our corruption index does not continue to stagnate, or corruption perception index does not continue to stagnate, and begins to move in the right direction. But I think you've outlined very nicely some thoughts about how we might do that in a slightly better fashion. So I want to thank you and say good night to the Globespan audience, and perhaps give you the final word since you're the man in Georgetown.
Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure chatting with you. I heard your skepticism about asking the people who are in charge in each institution to do their job. In my institution, I try my best. I'm sure in your institution, you try your best. I had the experience the other day. Remember, corruption will thrive and is given an opportunity where you have to line up and you don't want to line up. And I'll give you an example. I might be speaking out of turn, but I want to give you a positive example. There is a virtual line in applications made in court to process estates. So grandma dies, you need to process her estate, you file the application, and there's quite a long wait. And one day I noticed that someone had jumped the line. So my antenna went up, my radar went up, and I went to inquire. And I was told that it had been already observed that someone had jumped the line, and the judiciary and the registrar in charge had already implemented a numbering system so that as applications were filed, they were numbered and they were dealt with numerically, sequentially. So it was not possible to jump the line anymore. They had already solved the problem because they took ownership. They took ownership, and they didn't then even need to go and investigate to see who had taken the money to allow the line to be jumped in the first place. They took ownership and they solved the problem before it became a problem. And I was mightily impressed that day. But I think that kind of innovation and that kind of not staying in your ivory tower, but understanding the system of the institution you're in charge of and monitoring it, that is something that you either do or you don't do. And if you don't do, you should be fired.
Or maybe not fired. Trump is firing a bunch of. Maybe you have an opportunity to be educated about how to become a better manager in that context. Trump is just firing a bunch of people here, and maybe some good people have lost their jobs. So maybe I don't want you to fire the person who perhaps historically has sort of taken a bribe, but maybe help that person to better understand that it's in the interest of Guyana to not take the bribe and to ensure that the institution that he or she is a part of is working in a much better fashion.
You're a more forgiving man than I am, Terrence.
All right. Have a wonderful evening.
You too, sir. It was a pleasure.
Thank you as always.
And take care to our viewers, and thank you, Devin, for saving me.